The candles in the great hall of Ashvale Park had been burning for 3 hours when Lady Dorothea Ashvale rose from her chair, extended one gloved finger across the assembled company, and said, in a voice calibrated to carry to every corner of the room, that the maid had stolen her garnets. Every face in the drawing-room turned. Every conversation died. Henrietta Weber stood at the edge of the turkey carpet, her hands folded at her waist, her plain gray dress a clean line among the jeweled silks of the house party, and she did not flinch. She felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes settle on her the way one feels the first cold air of an open window, a physical sensation, spreading and definite and impossible to close out. What she did not do was look away. What she also did not do was speak. The silence that followed Lady Dorothea's pronouncement was the kind that precedes a verdict, and Henrietta had learned, in 23 years of careful living, that a verdict once spoken in a room full of witnesses tends to become permanent. She had not taken the garnets. She had not taken anything that did not belong to her in her entire life. These facts did not seem, at present, likely to help her. Henrietta had come to Ashvale Park 9 days earlier as the personal maid to Mrs. Alicia Fenn, a distant relation of the Ashvale family invited to the autumn house party. She had packed Mrs. Fenn's 3 trunks in London, endured the 2-day journey north on roads that made the carriage rattle like loose cutlery, and arrived at the park's stone front steps in the thin October light with one thought foremost in her mind. Do the work. Do it well. And make no trouble. That had always been her philosophy. At £12 a year, it was also a financial necessity. Ashvale Park was the kind of house that does not announce itself gradually. It presented all at once a long Georgian facade of pale stone with a sweep of lawn descending to a lake that went silver in the late afternoon. The surrounding woodland already turned to copper and rust. The interior was warm with old money, not the sharp display of a new fortune, but the accumulated weight of generations of good furniture, good paintings, and carpets worn thin in exactly the right places. Mrs. Pollock, the housekeeper, had met the household staff at the servants' entrance with a ring of keys at her waist and a manner that was fair and exacting in equal proportion. She had assigned Henrietta a narrow room at the east end of the attic corridor, shown her where the fire irons were kept, and said, with the brevity of a woman who had no time for unnecessary sentences, that the house ran on order and she expected it to continue to do so. The house party assembled over the following 2 days. There were 11 guests in addition to Mrs. Fenn, a viscount and his wife, 2 junior officers on leave, a pair of sisters from a family in the neighboring county whose name Henrietta had already forgotten, and Miss Cecily Vane, who arrived last in a traveling carriage that was slightly too new for her circumstances and wearing a traveling dress that was very nearly too fine. She was 25, copper-haired, with a smile that arrived at precisely the right moment and never quite reached her eyes. She had been placed in the rose bedroom, which was the second best in the house. Lady Dorothea had arranged the rooms herself. Lady Dorothea was Edmund Ashvale's mother, a woman in her middle 60s who wore her station the way some people wear their skin, so completely that they cannot imagine being without it. She had presided over Ashvale Park's autumn house parties for 40 years, first as the Earl's wife and then, since the previous Earl's death 7 years ago, as its acknowledged social authority. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The calibration of her tone was sufficient. A half-degree of coolness in the greeting, a barely perceptible pause before a name, and the message was delivered with perfect clarity to anyone in the room who was paying attention. Henrietta had been paying attention from the first evening. The garnets had disappeared on the night of the second day, which was a Tuesday. Lady Dorothea's garnet parure consisted of a necklace, 2 eardrops, and a bracelet, set in old gold and valued, as Henrietta would later learn, at £450. They had been worn to the first formal dinner and returned, according to Lady Dorothea, to the velvet case on her dressing table that same evening. By the following morning, the case was empty. Lady Dorothea had called for Mrs. Pollock at 7 o'clock and for the constable from the village at 8. The constable, a stout man named Grover, who was clearly unaccustomed to being called to the homes of earls, had arrived at 9 and had taken a brief account from every servant whose duties brought them to the upper floors. Henrietta had answered his questions directly, told him she had seen nothing unusual, and returned to Mrs. Fenn's dressing room to press the blue muslin for the afternoon. She had believed, at that point, that the matter was proceeding sensibly and would resolve itself through sensible means. She had been wrong about that. The gathering in the drawing room that evening had been assembled ostensibly for a card party. The fire was lit. The candles were burning. The company was dressed. Lady Dorothea had waited until the room was full, and the doors were closed before she spoke. Henrietta had been standing near the wall attending to Mrs. Fenn's shawl when the Countess rose, and the pronouncement came before she had any warning at all. "The garnet parure does not walk from a locked room without assistance," Lady Dorothea said, addressing the company rather than any single person. "Mrs. Pollock's inventory confirms that of the servants who had access to the east wing yesterday morning, one was observed near my dressing room at an hour when her duties gave her no reason to be there. I will not stand in my own house and permit a theft to pass without naming it." She turned, then, and her gaze settled on Henrietta, with the certainty of someone who had already concluded the matter in private and required only the public confirmation. The maid brought by Mrs. Fenn, the one standing at the back. A murmur moved through the room. Mrs. Fenn made a small, distressed sound. The Viscount's wife leaned toward her husband. Henrietta felt the attention of the room like pressure against her sternum, and forced herself to breathe steadily against it. If you are moved by this story, stay with it. There is more to come, and the part that matters most has not yet arrived. Constable Grover had noted, in his account that morning, that a footman named Thomas had been near the servants' stair at the same hour Henrietta was said to have been on the upper corridor. He had noted it, and then he had set it aside as less significant than Lady Dorothea's certainty about the maid. Thomas was 17, newly hired, and already visibly frightened by the constable's visit. If Henrietta had named him now, in front of the company, as the alternative possibility, she might have redirected enough doubt to give herself room. The thought arrived clearly and was set aside just as clearly. Thomas had done nothing wrong that she could prove. She had no evidence beyond proximity and timing, and proximity and timing were exactly what were being used against her. She would not do to a frightened boy what was being done to her. She said, "I did not take the jewels, my lady. I cannot name who did, for I do not know. I can only tell you what I did not do." Lady Dorothea regarded her for a moment with the expression of a woman who found plain speech from a maid both impertinent and irrelevant. "The constable will be informed," she said. "You will remain in the house until this is settled." The card party continued. Henrietta stood at the wall. What she did not see was the figure in the corridor beyond the partly open drawing-room door. Edmund Ashvale had returned from the stables 20 minutes earlier, still in his riding coat, intending to change before joining his guests. He had paused at the drawing-room door when he heard his mother's voice in its public address register and recognized the occasion. He had stood in the corridor throughout the exchange, one hand resting against the doorframe, and he had heard Henrietta's refusal to implicate Thomas with the specific quality of attention a man gives to something that contradicts what he expected. He stood there a moment longer after the room settled back into its murmured normality. Then he continued down the corridor to his rooms without entering the drawing room at all. He was 34 years old. He had been Earl of Ashvale for 7 years. He was not a man who displayed what he thought in company, and he was not a man who acted quickly on the strength of a single moment. His face, in the corridor light, was the face of someone recalculating. Mrs. Pollock found Henrietta the following morning in the linen room, refolding a set of pillowcases that did not need refolding. "The Earl wishes to speak with you," she said. "Not about the jewels," he says. "Or not only." 10 o'clock. The library. The library at Ashvale Park occupied the full length of the north wing's ground floor and smelled of beeswax, coal smoke, and the particular dry paper smell of books that have been read rather than merely owned. Edmund was standing at the window when Henrietta was shown in, looking out over the frost-gray lawn, and he turned when she entered with the deliberate movement of someone who had been waiting but was not going to show that he had been impatient about it. He was taller than she had registered from across the drawing room. His riding coat had been replaced by a dark coat and a plainly tied cravat, and there was a quality to his stillness that she recognized as discipline rather than ease, the kind of stillness that costs something to maintain. "Miss Weber," he said, "sit down." She sat. He did not sit. He remained standing at the window with one hand at his side and regarded her with gray eyes that were, she noticed, the precise color of the frost on the lawn behind him. "You declined, last night, to mention that Thomas Birch was also seen on the upper corridor at the relevant time. Constable Grover's notes confirmed it this morning." She kept her hands in her lap. "I had no reason to believe Thomas Birch had done anything. And yet naming him would have divided attention." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you not?" "Because I do not know that he took the jewels," she said. "And an accusation that cannot be proved is the same instrument that is being used against me. I would not use it." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. The frost on the lawn outside had begun to soften at its edges, where the morning light caught it, and the library was very quiet. "I see," he said. It was not a dismissal. It was the sound of a man who had received information he was now processing with care. He asked her, over the next quarter hour, about the upper corridor, about who else she had seen, about the timing of her own movements, about whether she had observed anything unusual in the Rose bedroom, which was directly adjacent to Lady Dorothea's. She answered each question directly, without embellishment, and did not volunteer a single detail she could not confirm. He listened with the focused attention of a man who was gathering rather than deciding. And she found, to her own discomfort, that being listened to in that particular way produced a response in her chest she preferred not to examine. She was not used to being heard. The conversation ended without resolution. He told her to remain at the house and to speak to no one outside the household about the matter. She stood, curtsied, and left the library, and did not allow herself to think until she had reached the attic stair and was out of sight of every window. The house party continued in the strained fashion of a gathering in which an accusation has been made and not yet resolved. Guests spoke in lower voices. The afternoon walks were shorter. At dinner that evening, Henrietta attended to Mrs. Fenn's chair and observed, because observation was a habit she had cultivated the way some people cultivate a useful tool, that Miss Cecily Vane was quieter than she had been on the first evening. Not subdued in the way of someone troubled by the household's tension. Quieter in the specific way of someone monitoring the room to determine how much was known. Henrietta had noted it. She did not yet know what to do with the observation. Edmund noticed it too, though Henrietta did not see this. What she saw was the Earl's face at the dinner table, level and unreadable, moving through the ordinary motions of a host, while his attention was clearly elsewhere. Once she caught him looking not at Cecily, but at the space directly in front of his own place setting. And the expression on his face before he controlled it was not coldness. It was the specific look of a man fighting down something old. Mrs. Pollock told Henrietta the truth of it 2 days later, in the kitchen passage, in the brief interval between the morning's duties and the afternoon's. "His late wife," she said, without preamble, because she was a woman who understood that preamble wasted time. "He was in London when she fell ill. She sent word that she was worse than the doctors had said, and he did not come immediately, because he had been told by others that she was inclined to worry unnecessarily." She paused, her keys still in her hand. "He came 3 days later. She had died the morning before he arrived." The keys moved in her hand. "The portrait in the east sitting room faces the wall because he turned it himself after, and no one has found it appropriate to turn it back." Henrietta stood in the kitchen passage and held that information inside her chest, where it landed with the specific weight of something she recognized, a person whose word had not been trusted in time. She understood that weight intimately. She was carrying something very like it herself. That evening she passed the east sitting room on her way upstairs, and paused, briefly, to look at the painting's gilt-framed back. The canvas was good, well stretched, and the frame was a quiet one, not ostentatious. He had not hidden her behind an elaborate border. He had simply turned her away from the room, which was a different thing entirely. Edmund had not been idle in those same days. On the morning following his conversation with Henrietta, he had gone to the library early and found, in the drawer of the writing desk that had been placed at his guest's disposal, a sealed letter that had slipped behind the drawer's inner lining and wedged itself against the back panel. The seal was broken. He recognized the handwriting on the outer fold as Cecily's, and the address as that of a gaming house in Covent Garden. He read it. It was a demand for settlement of a debt of £60, overdue by 11 weeks, carrying a threat of public disclosure if not paid by the month's end. He refolded it and placed it in his coat pocket and said nothing to anyone for 48 hours. In those 48 hours, he watched Cecily at dinner, on the afternoon walk, in the drawing room, with the calibrated attention of a man who was no longer gathering, but confirming. He watched the small, deliberate way she avoided the subject of the jewels without appearing to avoid it, the practiced ease with which she redirected any nearby conversation that veered toward the theft. He watched her watch Henrietta with an expression that contained, beneath the polished surface, something that was not quite triumph and not quite guilt, but sat between them like an unexploded charge. On the 6th day of the house party, Lady Dorothea moved formally. She called for Constable Grover and for her solicitor, a Mr. Baxter, who had arrived the previous evening at her private invitation, and who now stood in the drawing room with a leather case and the expression of a man prepared to execute instructions he found professionally routine. Lady Dorothea addressed the assembled guests with the composed authority of someone performing a function that the social order not only permitted, but required of her. A theft of £450 in jewels cannot be treated as a household inconvenience, she said. I have been patient. The evidence has not improved. The maid will be formally charged and remanded to the village until the matter is decided before a magistrate. The guests were very still. Mrs. Fenn produced a handkerchief. Henrietta was standing near the window, because she had been summoned to the drawing room and told to wait. And she had been waiting for 20 minutes. in the exact posture she had learned was the correct one for a maid in a room where decisions were being made about her. Straight, quiet, visible, and unobtrusive at the same time. She felt the cold clarity of the moment settle over her. Formal charges. A magistrate. Her wage was £12 a year. A prosecution, even one she survived, would follow her for the remainder of her working life, because character references, once shadowed, do not fully recover. She understood all of this. She also understood that she had only one thing left to give the moment, and it was the same thing she had given every other moment in this house. "I am willing to be questioned," she said into the silence that followed Lady Dorothea's pronouncement. "By anyone. About anything I witnessed, heard, or observed in this house. I will not say more than I know, and I will not say less. That is all I have." Lady Dorothea turned to look at her with the expression she had apparently reserved for this occasion. A patient, sorrowful certainty. The expression of a woman who found it distasteful but necessary to be right. Edmund spoke from the door. He had been standing in the doorway for perhaps 2 minutes, which was long enough to hear everything. He came into the room now with the deliberate movement of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it. And the room shifted around him in the way rooms shift when someone enters who is unambiguously the authority. "Mr. Baxter," he said, "you will not be needed today. I am grateful for your attendance, and I will arrange for your expenses." He looked at Constable Grover. "Please remain." He looked at his mother, and the flatness in his voice was not rudeness. It was the absolute terminus of a negotiation. "I ask you to wait." Then he crossed to the door that connected the drawing room to the library, opened it, and said, "Miss Vane, come in, please." There was a pause of perhaps 5 seconds, which is a long time when 20 people are holding their breath. Cecily came into the drawing room from the library with her chin level and her color very high. She had the look of someone who had been holding a position for 6 days and knew, in this moment, that the position was no longer tenable. Edmund stood at the center of the room. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the letter, unfolded it, and held it so that the room could see, though he did not read it aloud. He said, "This was found in the library writing desk. The debt it describes falls precisely within the value of the missing jewels. The Covent Garden address it references is one my steward confirmed yesterday, by post, to be associated with a gaming establishment." He looked at Cecily with the level gray attention he had been giving the frost-covered lawn 5 days earlier. "I am giving you the opportunity to speak before I speak for you." Cecily's composure held for 3 more seconds. Henrietta watched the precise moment it did not. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was something quieter and more final. The withdrawal of a sustained effort, visible in the small relaxation of the jaw, the fractional drop of the shoulders, the breath taken differently. "I intended to return them," Cecily said. Her voice was flat. "Before the party ended. I needed the money to settle the debt before the deadline, and I intended to say they had been misplaced, and then to return them before anyone looked further." She was not looking at Henrietta. She was looking at the floor. "I did not think the maid would be named." The room was very quiet. "Where are they?" Edmund said. "My trunk, the smaller one, the hatbox lining." Mrs. Pollock left the room immediately and returned in 4 minutes carrying the velvet case. She opened it on the side table. The garnet parure lay in its fitted interior. The necklace, the 2 eardrops, the bracelet, the old gold undimmed, every stone seated correctly. £450, recovered before any instrument of the law had required it. Lady Dorothea had not moved from her chair. Her fan was in her hand. Henrietta could see, in the set of the older woman's face, the specific reconfiguration of a person whose script has been removed from them, who must now speak without it. The confidence had not gone out of Lady Dorothea's face entirely. It had been redirected inward, which was, Henrietta thought, the beginning of something that might eventually become recognition. Constable Grover cleared his throat, produced his notebook, and said that he would need to take Miss Vane's statement. Cecily nodded, very slightly, and followed him to the far end of the room, and the party separated around them the way water separates around a stone. Edmund remained at the center of the room. He looked at Henrietta for a moment, that was neither long nor short, but felt suspended. She had not moved from the window. The morning light was cold and clear on her plain gray dress. She was not, in this moment, doing anything at all except existing in the space she occupied with the complete specific quality of a person who had always been there, who had always been what she was, who had simply been waiting for the room to turn in the right direction. "Miss Weber," he said. And then he stopped. He tried again. "Henrietta." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She felt it land in the same place the library silence had landed, that careful listening quality, except this was not consideration. This was recognition. He crossed the 3 yards of turkey carpet between them and addressed her in a voice pitched for her hearing only, which nonetheless carried in the quiet room to most of the people present. Because a quiet room in a house party carries everything. "You were accused in front of this company," he said. "You were accused by my household, under my roof, and you bore it with more honesty than I deserved from you. What you did for Thomas Birch, and what you have done in this room since the first evening, is not a thing I will allow to pass without saying plainly that I saw it." He paused. The muscle in his jaw was the jaw of a man who is not accustomed to unstructured sentences and who is constructing this one carefully, in public, without preparation. "I would ask you to remain at Ashvale Park, not as Mrs. Fenn's maid, as my guest, for as long as you choose." The room understood this. They were Regency guests, people fluent in the language of such requests, and there was not one of them present who missed the weight of it. The Viscount's wife touched her husband's sleeve. Mrs. Fenn pressed her handkerchief to her mouth more firmly. Lady Dorothea's fan made a single, controlled movement. She was looking at her son. Her expression was not the expression of a woman who agreed. It was the expression of a woman who had just understood that her agreement was no longer the deciding factor, and who was, with considerable private effort, arriving at the beginning of acceptance. "Your Grace," Henrietta said, and then stopped, because she had used the wrong form of address and knew it. He was an earl, not a duke. "My lord," she corrected herself, and something happened in his face that she had not seen before, not quite amusement and not quite warmth, but a thing that contained elements of both and was more affecting than either because it was so clearly unfamiliar to him. "I would stay," she said. "Yes." Mrs. Pollock closed the velvet case on the side table and set it carefully to one side. She looked at Henrietta with the expression of someone who had been watching a particular situation develop for several days and was satisfied, though not surprised, with the way it had resolved. She left the room then with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had already moved on to the next task. If you have stayed with this story, leave a word in the comments. It costs nothing, and it means more than you might think. Cecily Vane departed Ashvale Park the following morning in the carriage she had arrived in, accompanied by Constable Grover's written record and the knowledge that the gaming house debt would follow her regardless of what she sold next. She was not, by the standards of the social machinery she had moved through all her life, destroyed. She was displaced. She was removed from a particular field by the specific mechanism of her own action being named aloud, and the circle of society in which she had been certain of her position would need some considerable time to forget it. That was the sentence the room's moral weather had delivered, and it was, Henrietta believed, the correct one. The remaining days of the house party passed with a quality of altered atmosphere that is particular to rooms where something irrevocable has been said aloud. The guests were warmer, collectively, than they had been. The Viscount's wife made a point of sitting near Henrietta at breakfast and addressing her in conversation on subjects that had nothing to do with theft or maids or garnets, and there was in that small, deliberate gesture the social confirmation that a verdict had been overturned and another had been issued in its place. Mrs. Fenn wept once more, briefly, and then recovered herself and was, in Henrietta's private estimation, both relieved and somewhat aggrieved at having been at the center of an inconvenient situation, which was an entirely human response, and one Henrietta forgave without difficulty. Edmund did not press her. He had made his statement, and he appeared to understand that the weight of it required time to settle, both for her and for himself. He spoke with her at dinner, and once in the garden on the 7th day, where the frost had returned, and the gravel walk was silver-white under a sky that had gone the deep gray of coming weather. He walked with a measured pace and spoke of the park, the woodland at the lake's far edge, the kitchen gardens that produced more than the household could consume. He spoke of the estate's management with the directness of a man who was accustomed to being informed rather than entertained, and she found that she had opinions about estate management that she had never had occasion to express to anyone before, and that he received those opinions without surprise, as if it were entirely ordinary for a lady's maid to know that the Eastern Woodlands drainage problem was consistent with the wet October they had had, and that the kitchen garden surplus might be sold to the village chandler rather than left to the cold. They were standing at the lake's edge when he told her about his wife. Not everything, and not all at once. He told her that her name had been Frances, and that she had been ill for 4 months before she died, and that he had received her letter 3 days before he came north, and that he had not come immediately because the doctors had told him it was not yet acute, and that he had been told the same by his estate manager who had visited Frances in his stead and reported her spirits as tolerable. He had believed them because it was easier to believe them than to examine his own reasons for not wanting to leave London at that particular time. He did not say what those reasons were. He did not need to. "You turned her portrait," Henrietta said. "Yes, because you could not stop looking at it." He was quiet for a moment. The lake surface was the same gray as his eyes, and the cold was settling around them both, and she could see his breath in the still air. "Because I could not stop understanding it." She said nothing to that. There was nothing to say that would not diminish it. The cold moved between them in its ordinary way, and it was not uncomfortable. The house party ended on the 10th day, as it had always been scheduled to end, and the guests departed in a scatter of carriages and trunks and formal farewells, conducted under the gray portico, while the grooms brought the horses out. Mrs. Fenn embraced Henrietta at length, with more feeling than she had displayed in the entire 3 years of their association, and pressed into her hands a small sum of money which Henrietta accepted, because it was offered with genuine warmth and refusal would have been unkind. Then the last carriage went down the drive, and the gravel settled into silence, and the house became itself again, stone and old wood, and the particular smell of long habitation, the fire in the great hall still burning, the candles being snuffed by the under-housekeeper in the drawing-room, the kitchen sounds settling into the familiar rhythms of a house that was no longer performing for company. Lady Dorothea came to the library that afternoon. Henrietta was there because Edmund had told her to use it freely, and she had been sitting in the chair by the window with a book she was not reading, watching the copper leaves come off the oak at the lawn's edge in the wind. Lady Dorothea entered without announcement, which was her right in her own house, and stood for a moment just inside the door. She looked older than she had during the house party. Not diminished, but reduced to her actual dimensions after days of occupying the enlarged space of social authority. "You will stay," she said. It was not a question. "I believe so," Henrietta said. Lady Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Her fan was not in her hand. Her hands, Henrietta noticed, were folded in front of her in the simple posture of a woman who is not performing and is not certain what else to do. "You were not what I believed you to be," she said finally, with the measured delivery of a person whose every word has been constructed with care. "That is my error." She paused. "I do not generally speak these sentences." "I know," Henrietta said. Something passed across Lady Dorothea's face that was not warmth, but was the foundation on which warmth might eventually be built. She inclined her head, 1 precise degree, and left the library. The first snow came the day after. It arrived overnight, silently, and Henrietta discovered it when she woke before dawn and went to the window of the bedroom she now occupied, which was not the narrow attic room, but a room in the east wing with a view over the back garden and a fire that Mrs. Pollock had arranged to be lit the previous evening. The garden was white under the first light, very still, the kitchen garden walls barely visible under an even layer, the oak at the lawn's edge already weighted with it. She stood at the window in her nightgown, with her shawl pulled around her shoulders, and watched the snow continue in the absolute quiet of a world that had, during the night, been remade. She heard the door to the east sitting room open and close. She heard Edmund step in the corridor, and then it paused outside her door. And then there was a knock. A single measured knock. The knock of a man who was uncertain of his welcome, but had decided to ask anyway. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood in the doorway, still dressed from the previous evening, with the disordered look of a man who had not slept. Though his coat was straight and his cravat was, improbably, still passably tied. He looked at her at the window, with the winter light white behind her and the snow settling on the garden, and she watched his face do the thing it had done in the great hall, open for a moment in a way that was not composed or calibrated or disciplined, and then settle into something that was not composure, but was perhaps steadier than it, a kind of arrived at certainty. He crossed the room to the window and stood beside her, and they looked at the garden together for a moment that was neither short nor long but was complete, in the way that some moments are complete. Closed circles in which everything that needed to be said has been said by the room and the light and the snow and the specific proximity of two people who have stopped pretending to be other than they are. "I went to the east sitting room," he said. She turned to look at him. I turned the portrait round. He was looking at the garden. It seemed correct. A pause. She would have thought very little of my management of this situation. She would have been right, Henrietta said. The thing on his face that was not quite amusement arrived again, more settled this time, less unfamiliar. His hand, resting on the window frame, moved an inch toward hers without completing the distance, and she moved her own hand that same inch, and they stood in the cold morning light at the window of a house that was, in its quiet and specific way, beginning to be hers. The garnet parure sat in its velvet case on Lady Dorothea's dressing table, all 4 pieces present, the old gold warm against the fitted interior. The portrait of Frances Ashvale hung in the east sitting room again, facing the room, the light from the tall windows falling across a face that was kind, painted by someone who had known her. The fire in the great hall burned low and steady. The snow kept falling on Ashvale Park, and the house held them all inside it. And Henrietta Weber stood at the window of the east wing in the white morning. And she was not a problem to be solved, or a maid to be discharged, or a woman whose word carried no weight in the rooms where decisions were made. She was named. She was seen. She was home.